So you want to own a knight's manor. Ride out at dawn on a horse worth more than the mill. Hear tenants call you my lord, as you pass the church. Go home to a hall with a fire that never goes out, because someone else is paid to keep it burning. Simple enough, on paper. The problem is that this picture is the reward at the end of a very expensive contract, not a description of the income statement. A knight's manor wasn't a passive holding. It was a military obligation with land attached to pay for it, and for most of the men who held one, the land barely covered the obligation. Start with the number that breaks the fantasy immediately. By the middle of the 13th century, English record keepers valued a standard knight's fee, the unit of land theoretically sufficient to support one mounted, armored soldier for the king, at roughly £20 a year in income. That figure comes from feudal aids and scutage assessments collected in the 100 Rolls of 1279, one of the most detailed property surveys to survive from medieval England. £20 a year sounds like a living. It wasn't. It was the gross revenue of the entire estate, before a single expense was paid, and the expense sitting at the top of that ledger was the knight himself. Before you can calculate what a manor earned, you have to calculate what it cost simply to become the kind of man a manor was built to support. A knight wasn't a title. It was a piece of military equipment wearing a person. A trained warhorse, a destrier bred and conditioned for combat rather than farm work, ran between £15 and £25 in the 13th century, and premium bloodstock imported from Lombardy or Spain could run considerably higher. A hauberk of riveted mail cost another £3 to £5. A helmet, shield, sword, and lance added roughly £2 to £4 more. Add a second, cheaper riding horse for travel, a squire's annual keep, and the cost of replacing equipment lost or damaged in the field, and the entry price for the equipment alone before land, before a hall, before a single tenant paid rent, sat between £25 and £40. That's more than a full year of the manor's total gross income, spent before the manor produced a single shilling. So the real question isn't what a manor earned. It's what a manor had to earn just to keep one specific person armed, mounted, and available for 40 days of unpaid royal service a year. That's the trap. The fee existed to fund the horse existed to fund the obligation, and the obligation is the only reason the land was granted in the first place. Stack the numbers in one place and the trap becomes a ledger. A destrier, £15 to £25. A hauberk, £3 to £5. A helmet, shield, sword and lance together, £2 to £4. A second riding horse and a squire's annual keep, another £3 to £5. Total entry cost before the first tenant pays a penny of rent, £23 to £39, against £20 of gross annual income from the fee that's supposed to support all of it. Filling the obligation costs more than the land produces in a year. The land was never meant to pay for the horse outright. It was meant to pay for it slowly, over several years of careful surplus, which is exactly the margin a single bad harvest could erase. A knight's manor also covered a wide range of actual holdings, so the entry cost scaled differently depending on tier. At the minimum viable tier, a single knight's fee, you held one village or a cluster of hamlets, perhaps 1,000 to 1,500 acres of arable, meadow and waste, with a manor house that was often barely more than a fortified farmhouse, a hall, a solar, a kitchen block, a palisade rather than stone walls. Annual gross income sat close to that £20 benchmark, drawn mostly from tenant rents and the produce of the lord's own domain land. Staff was minimal, a reeve to run daily operations and a bailiff to collect rents, with perhaps 2 or 3 permanent household servants and the rest of the labor supplied by the tenants themselves rather than paid wages. At the realistic mid-tier, a knight might hold 2 or 3 manors, through inheritance, marriage or sub-infeudation from a greater lord, pushing combined gross income to £40 or £60 a year. This tier could support a stone-built hall rather than timber, a small permanent garrison of 2 or 3 additional men-at-arms, and enough surplus to actually save rather than merely service the equipment debt. Land at this scale typically came bundled with a marriage settlement or wardship grant, both of which carried their own fees payable to the crown, often £100 to £200 for the wardship right alone. That's a cost easily overlooked by anyone imagining the land arrived free. At full scale, a baronial tier holding of 10 or more knights' fees, income could run into the hundreds of pounds annually, but the obligations scaled just as fast. A baron holding 10 fees didn't personally ride to war 10 times. He owed the crown 10 knights' worth of service, meaning he either sub-infeudated land to subtenant knights who owed him the same 40 days he owed the king, or paid scutage, a cash fine in place of service, calculated per fee and rising sharply whenever a major campaign was underway. By Edward I's Welsh campaigns in the 1280s, scutage rates had climbed to £1 or more per fee per campaign season, so a 10-fee baron could face a £10 or greater cash bill in a single year just to avoid marching. At every tier there was a second entry cost that rarely shows up until it's already owed, the relief. When a knight's fee passed from father to son, the heir didn't simply inherit it. He paid the crown, or his immediate overlord, a relief fee to formally take possession, conventionally set at £5 per fee by the 12th century and often renegotiated upward under a cash-hungry king. A minor heir faced an even steeper cost. If the previous holder died before his son came of age, the fee passed into wardship, and whoever purchased that wardship right, often the crown itself or a favored courtier, collected the entire income of the manor until the heir turned 21, then frequently sold the boy's marriage to the highest bidder as a separate transaction. An heir could inherit a fully solvent manor and still emerge from his own minority with less capital than the stranger who had spent 7 years farming his land for someone else's profit. The mechanism that actually made a manor solvent had almost nothing to do with rent in cash. Under the manorial system, tenants split broadly into free tenants, who paid rent in coin or fixed produce and owed little else, and villein tenants, who held their land in exchange for labor, not money. A villein holding a standard 30-acre yardland typically owed what the records call week work, commonly 2 or 3 days of labor on the lord's own domain fields every week of the year, rising to daily labor during the harvest boon works when every hand mattered. That labor wasn't paid. It was the rent. Here's how the value actually moved. The lord held a block of domain land, often a third or more of the manor's arable acreage, farmed directly for his own profit rather than let out to tenants. Plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting that domain required labor. Hiring free wage laborers for that work, at the going rate of roughly a penny to 3 pence a day depending on the task and the season, would have consumed most of the domain's own output in wages before a single sack of grain reached market. Villein week work replaced that wage bill entirely. The tenant supplied the labor because he owed it, not because he was paid for it, and the grain grown on the domain with that free labor was sold at market for pure profit, minus only the reeve's oversight and the seed corn. Rent in cash kept a manor from starving. Rent in labor is what made it profitable. This is where most modern assumptions about medieval land fail completely. People assume a lord's wealth came from rent collection, the same way a modern landlord collects a check. It didn't, not primarily. A well-run domain farmed with free villein labor could out-earn the entire manor's cash rents combined, because the labor cost that would have eaten the profit simply didn't exist on the books. The catch is that this only works under specific conditions. The villein has to owe the labor rather than get paid for it, the domain has to be large enough to actually need that labor, and the harvest itself can't fail, because unlike a wage bill, an unpaid labor obligation can't be reduced when the crop is thin, but the crop still can. Manorial accounts, where they survive, treat labor services as a line item with an assigned cash value even though no cash ever changed hands, which is itself a clue to how central the mechanism was. A reeve's account roll typically lists the number of days owed by the villein tenantry that year, the number actually worked, the number excused, and a notional wage value assigned to each, usually a penny or so per day for unskilled fieldwork. That notional value existed purely so the lord's steward could compare on paper what the domain would have cost to run with hired labor against what it actually cost with owed labor. The gap between those two figures, multiplied across every villein holding on the manor, is the closest thing medieval accounting has to a profit and loss statement for the entire mechanism, and on most surviving rolls the gap is the single largest number on the page. That sounds like free money, but a naive projection leaves something out. Owed labor isn't interchangeable labor. A villein performing plowing service he's legally obliged to complete has no reason to plow well rather than adequately, and no lord could station himself in every field at once to check. Account rolls from multiple English manors record recurring expenditure on a hayward or under bailiff whose entire job was inspecting boon work quality, and on replacement seed or repeated plowing where the first pass had been done poorly enough to fail. None of that labor supervision cost appears in the simple arithmetic of days owed times notional wage. It's the manor's version of the invisible cost that eats every unpaid labor system, enforcement. Villein labor was compulsory, but it was also, by every surviving account, resentful and inefficiently supervised labor, and that oversight cost was a permanent, recurring line item on every account roll that survives. One manor's surviving records make this entire mechanism visible in unusual detail. Cuxham, a small manor in Oxfordshire held by Merton College from the 13th century onward, preserved an almost unbroken run of account rolls from 1276 to 1359, studied extensively by the economic historian P.D.A. Harvey. Those rolls show a domain of roughly 300 acres worked overwhelmingly by villein week work rather than hired labor, with wage payments to outside laborers reserved almost entirely for skilled tasks the villeins weren't obligated to perform, like thatching or milling repairs. In good harvest years, Cuxham's domain grain sales alone could roughly match or exceed the manor's entire cash rent income, precisely because the largest single cost of production, labor, had been extracted as an obligation rather than purchased as a wage. Cuxham wasn't unusually well run. It was simply well documented, and what it documents is the ordinary mechanism, not an exceptional one. The Cuxham pattern isn't an isolated curiosity. Aggregate figures compiled from the 100 rolls of 1279 across several Midland counties show villein holdings owing weak work consistently outnumbering fully commuted cash rent holdings on manors with domains above roughly 200 acres, while smaller domains, unable to fully occupy a large labor force anyway, leaned more heavily on cash rent from the start. That lines up with the mechanism itself. The labor obligation only pays for itself at scale. A domain too small to need 3 days of plowing a week from every villein holding gains nothing from insisting on the labor rather than simply collecting the rent, which is precisely why the smallest, most marginal knights' fees in the record tended toward cash tenancy, while the manors attached to wealthier lords and larger domains clung to labor service the longest, in some regions of England well into the 14th century. Not every lord who held a knight's fee ran it well, and the difference between the ones who prospered and the ones who slowly sank into debt had almost nothing to do with the size of their land. The lords who did best commuted labor services into cash rent selectively, at the moments the cash economy favored it, rather than clinging to unpaid labor out of habit. By the late 13th century, wage rates and grain prices had both risen enough that some lords found it more profitable to accept a cash payment in place of a tenant's labor obligation and hire wage workers instead, particularly for skilled tasks. Lords who tracked that shifting balance and adjusted manor by manor, year by year, kept their domain profitable through price swings that ruined less attentive neighbors. The lords who prospered also matched the size of their domain to the labor actually available, rather than expanding the home farm simply because the land was theirs to plow. A domain too large for its villein population to service through obligation forced the lord back onto the open wage market at exactly the moment his own free labor supply had already been spent. And the best-run manors treated the manorial court, where tenants paid fees for legal disputes, land transfers, and the heriot payment owed on a tenant's death, as a genuine revenue stream rather than an afterthought, often generating 10% or more of a manor's annual cash income from court fees alone, according to surviving court rolls collected across multiple English counties in the National Archives. A few habits separated the manors that stayed solvent from the ones that didn't. A reeve who was himself a tenant with a real stake in the manor's output tended to run things differently than an outsider collecting a flat wage regardless of the harvest. A lord who personally reviewed the account roll, rather than handing oversight entirely to a steward with no long-term interest in the estate, caught problems earlier. Marriage and wardship worked better as capital events planned for in advance than as emergencies financed on the spot, since a wardship fee paid in cash cost far less than one financed through a moneylender at short notice. And the 40 days of royal service worked best treated as a fixed, predictable cost budgeted every year rather than a surprise bill, since scutage assessments were published well in advance of most campaigns. It was the lords who spent their surplus, assuming the crown wouldn't call that year, who got ruined. The lords who slid into debt tended to share a different habit, treating a good harvest year's surplus as permanent income rather than a buffer against the next bad one. A knight's fee's income was tied directly to weather, soil, and the health of a single season's crop, with no diversification available at the scale of one or two manors. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, which struck northern Europe with repeated years of catastrophic harvest failure, didn't discriminate between careful and careless lords, but it discriminated brutally between those who had banked several years of surplus grain and cash against exactly that risk, and those who had spent every surplus year as though it were the new baseline. The tenants' labor bought the warhorse, not their rent. That's the entire structure in one sentence, and it explains why the arithmetic of a knight's manor never resembles a modern balance sheet. The rent kept the household fed. The labor bought the war. A villein owed roughly 2 to 3 days of unpaid labor a week on the lord's domain. A knight owed roughly 40 days of unpaid service a year to the crown. Neither man was paid in cash for the obligation that defined his entire relationship to the land. The manor sat in the middle of both debts, collecting the first to discharge the second, and calling the whole arrangement land ownership. That also explains why commutation, the shift from owed labor to cash rent, spread unevenly rather than all at once across England. It wasn't a single policy decision. It was thousands of individual lords, manor by manor, weighing the same trade, whether the going wage rate for hired labor had risen high enough, or the villein population had shrunk enough after a plague year, that continuing to enforce weak work cost more in oversight and resentment than simply collecting the cash equivalent and hiring workers on the open market instead. After the Black Death reached England in 1348 and cut the available labor force by perhaps a third to a half almost overnight, that calculation flipped decisively in most of the country, and the century that followed saw labor service collapse toward cash rent across most English manors within a few generations. Not because lords became more generous, but because the mechanism that had made unpaid labor profitable, an abundant, replaceable tenant population, had simply stopped existing. Picture 3 men holding a single knight's fee under identical terms in 1280. The first holds a manor of 1,200 acres with a small domain and a mostly free tenantry paying cash rent. His gross income sits close to £18 a year. His equipment and horse cost him £30 up front, financed through a loan from a local monastery at interest, and because his domain is small, his labor costs are mostly cash wages. After equipment debt service, garrison costs during his 40 days of royal service, and ordinary household expenses, he nets perhaps £4 or £5 a year, a bare survival margin that leaves nothing for repairs or a bad harvest. One thin harvest, one unplanned scutage assessment, one horse that goes lame in the field, and the monastery holding his loan starts pressing for repayment on land he can't afford to sell and can't afford to keep. The second holds an identical fee, but with a domain worked almost entirely by villain weak work rather than hired wages, and a manor court he runs personally rather than delegating to a lax steward. His gross income is the same £18, but his labor costs are near zero, his court fees add another £2 a year, and his net surplus after equipment debt and service obligations reaches £8 to £10, enough to begin repaying the horse and armor within 3 or 4 years rather than carrying that debt for a decade. By the time the first man is renegotiating his monastery loan, the second man owns his equipment outright and has begun setting aside grain reserves against the next bad harvest, the same reserves that will let him survive a famine year the first man can't. The third holds 2 fees rather than one, inherited jointly with a cousin's wardship, giving him £36 in combined gross income but also double the scutage exposure whenever the crown calls a campaign, double the equipment replacement risk, and the added cost of a second household, a second reeve, and a second set of court fees to administer. In a peaceful year he nets more than either of the single fee holders, comfortably enough that any neighbor glancing at his hall or stable would call him the wealthiest of the three. In a war year, when scutage is called on both fees simultaneously and one of his 2 horses is lost or killed in the field, his costs can exceed the first man's entire annual income in a single season. It's this third holder, not the smallest one, who's most likely to appear in the record a generation later borrowing against the manor to a moneylender or a monastic house, his heir inheriting 2 fees worth of obligation and 1 fee's worth of remaining solvency. Notice the logic sitting underneath all 3 scenarios. The knight who prospered wasn't the one who owned more land, held a bigger fee, or rode a finer horse. He was the one who understood correctly and early exactly which obligation the manor existed to fund, and priced everything else against that single fact rather than against the comfortable appearance of owning a manor at all. So you ride out at dawn on a horse worth more than the mill, past tenants who call you my lord as you pass the church, and none of it tells you whether the manor is solvent. The horse was never paid for by the rent in your hand. It was paid for by the labor you never had to pay a wage for, extracted a day at a time from men who owed it and resented every hour of it. The only real difference between the lord who prospered and the one who quietly sold his fee to a wealthier neighbor a generation later was which one of them understood that.